Thank you, first of all, for Dr. Cordoba and Professor Puster for setting up this conference. Yeah, I would really like to express my appreciation for this project, and I hope that there will be a follow-up conference and we will work on this relation between our two institutes. And I see great potential for this, and hope I can also contribute a little bit to this with the upcoming talk, which I entitled A Theory of Interest Rates. Now, okay, let's just start. Okay, so this is economics. I mean, for you as philosophers, I mean, we don't start with action, yeah, but maybe we'll go there. We'll get there eventually. Yeah. So, but let's start with the phenomenon first that we would like to address, that we would like to explain, and this is the rate of interest. Yeah. So, what is interest? Just to make things clear, I have here illustrated what we economists understand by interest. Yeah. We have any entrepreneur starts out with some expenditure, which you may call his operating expenditure or whatever it's called total expenditure. And then he sells his product, hopefully, at a greater price than what he expended in the first place, and that makes up for his revenue. And now this revenue covers his expenditure in the first place. We call this cost of goods sold in the accounting scheme. And then there is another margin that he makes, which we either label gross interest. And gross interest, but gross interest includes depreciation costs, repairs, and risk premium, etc. And then if we deduct these things, then what remains is the profit. Yeah? And that profit, again, can be subdivided into what we call entrepreneurial profit and interest. And what is the difference between interest and entrepreneurial profit? Well, entrepreneurial profit is that component that can be competed away, that in theory could vanish if enough other entrepreneurs enter that market, yeah, so that there's no extra margins to be gained. However, interest, that's the margin that cannot vanish in a free market economy, and that's the phenomenon that we would like to explain. Okay? Now, what do we understand by an explanation? Well, working in the tradition of Karl Menger, it's maybe worthwhile to look at what he understands by the term explanation. And here is a quote that I take from his second major publication. He says, "The goal of scholarly research is not only the cognition, but also the understanding of phenomena. We have gained cognition of a phenomenon when we have attained a mental image of it. We understand it when we have recognized the reason for its existence and for its characteristic quality, i.e., the reason for its being and for its being like it is." So that's what we would like to understand. We would like to understand why is there the rate of interest and why does it take on that value and not another. Yeah? Of course, this is not empirical research. This is not that we say we like to ask the questions, why were interest rates at that value in 2003? That's not what we're asking. We're asking, why is it generally, why is the phenomenon interest, why does it take up these values and not others? And what are the essential factors driving and determining the rate of interest? Now, of course, the Austrian school has given some answers to this question, and today most Austrian economists, they adhere to the so-called pure time preference theory of interest. And this means that the phenomenon of interest, as I've just described it, is seen as the exclusive result of individual time preference. And furthermore, it is held that such time preference is a category of human action. That means that this time preference is implied in the fact that human beings act. It's praxeology proper in their understanding. And now I have to confess, that I think this is wrong. And then, Mr. Puster, we didn't talk before I gave my talk, but you just said that what Austrians claim about time preference is probably too strong. And I think you're totally right, so I'm glad we agree on that. And why is this problematic? Well, first of all, the theory, the time preference theory, endorses the so-called discounting approach. And what's the discounting approach? Well, it means that we can determine the factor prices, that means the prices of the factors of production, simply through discounting. All we have to know is the prices of consumer goods, and then we count the numbers of stages that they are maybe apart from the final consumption stage, and then we, so to say, work it out, and for any given price we will know the quantity of that factor provided in equilibrium. Now, this is problematic for two reasons. First of all, what's that discounting? Discounting necessitates a cardinal connotation. Discounting means that we are actually making calculations. We are somehow taking a price and then we are putting a discount. That's a mathematical operation. And of course, that cannot be contained in praxeology, because praxeology in itself is devoid of cardinal numbers and all that, and mathematical operations. So there's a big problem. I don't think that time preference the theory can keep its promises there. If at all, then I think discounting is a method of appraisement, but it's not one of subjective valuation. And second, when we look at, or when we integrate this with capital theory, then as I just said, and Hayek shows this in his Prices and Production, then he starts out with some demand curve here on the right-hand side for some product, which is the consumer good, in fact, and then the demand for the goods at the higher stages is simply determined by discounting. Discounting, that's the line that's going down in the southwest, and then the demand curves at those respective stages are simply the result of discounting. And I think that's a very strong claim. I don't think that's really applicable. I don't think that we can actually really support this. And there's George Reisman saying that this approach, in essence, is the denial of supply and demand, because, as you may note, there's no supply curve here for the factors of production. There's a demand curve, which we get through discounting, but where is actually the supply curve? There's no supply curve for factors of production here, and I think this will run into problems when integrated with capital theory as well. But that shall not be the topic of my talk today. I think Eduard is going to tell us more about capital theory later on. However, in any case, I would just point out that I also see some problems in the interface of capital and interest rate theory when this approach is applied. For the moment, however, I would like to put forward an alternative theory for the rate of interest, one that is not rooted in time preference alone. I forgot something, sorry. Mind you that those demand curves, as we see them here, are determined by the marginal value product of each factor. This is just like in neoclassical economics, where the demand for a factor of production is determined by its marginal value product. And consequently, we would think that changing the productivity of a certain factor will have an effect on these demands. However, there's really a lot of ambiguity in the Austrian literature when we ask you, so what's the effect on the rate of interest if that productivity changes? In fact, here's a quote from Ingo Pellinger. He says, whereas Vetter, he's the godfather of that theory, by the way, whereas Vetter predicts that a rise in productivity will lower the rate of interest, Rothbard asserts that it will not affect the rate of interest at all. Kirchner does not exclude that it will affect the rate of interest, whereas Garrison contends that it might actually lower the rate. Okay? So that's a very, very unsatisfactory state of affairs. Yeah? If we Austrians, in our rate of interest, cannot tell us any, or have such conflicting views on the role of productivity in the rate of interest. And that also shows that there may be a problem with the theory. And then there is a quote by Israel Kirchner, and he says, what the pure time preference theory addresses is a question that is different from that of interest rate determination. So he gives it away and says, you know, we have an interest rate theory here, but actually we don't explain the rate of interest. We're just explaining why interest exists in general. We cannot say anything about its magnitude whatsoever. Yeah? And that, again, is quite unsatisfactory. And as I said, I also contend that this pure time preference theory is not praxeological either. That's because it includes cardinal operations, mathematical operations, which I think should be left out in that type of theory. And so I suggest to work it back and to take a step back and go back to praxeology, which is essentially action theory as we learned today, and it's part of analytical philosophy. We all know that. We've learned it from you guys. Okay? And here's an example of a theory which I think is praxeological, and that's the interest theory of Jörg Guido Hülsmann. He published a paper in 2002 or 2001, I believe, and he comes up with a theory that explains interest not using the concept of time preference, but rather using the concept of what he calls originary interest. Now, what is this? Well, he starts out with a statement saying that there is necessarily a value difference between means and ends. We all know that all action is bound in a means-end context. Okay, so far so good. Yeah? But he also claims that every actor will value the end higher than the means. Now, how does he come up with this? Well, he says, you know, look at this. Action, necessarily, is the exchange of one state against another. So you're giving up a less desired state for a more desired state. Moreover, action is triggered by uneasiness. Yeah? So we are actually, we are feeling uncomfortable with the state that we're giving up, and we will exchange it for something more favorable. And from there, we can conclude that there must be a value difference, that the thing that we are striving for must be of greater value than the thing that we're giving up. That's basically all. Okay, so that's what this phenomenon, or this category of human action, is what he calls originary interest. Okay, and why originary interest? Because he says interest as a monetary phenomenon emerges from this fact as it is contained in human action. Now, how does this go about? Well, he explains that every entrepreneur in the monetary economy, mind you that this theorem applies to monetary economies alone, yeah? But he says, okay, that any entrepreneur proceeds by estimating the selling receipts for a future product, and then in light of these expectations, bids for factors of production, okay? And the sum total of his bids will always be less than the sum total of what he expects for his selling receipts. And why is that? Well, because, well, we would say, yeah, because he wants to make money, yeah, right, okay. And in more scientific or academic terms, we could say, well, the money that he holds in his hands is the means to obtaining a great amount of money at some point in the future, which is his end, okay. And this value difference, yeah, he values the end higher than the original means, and that's the originary interest. Okay? He has this originary interest in making more money in the future. Okay, and then he, if successful, he earns a spread. Yeah? He earns some money, and that spread is brought about because he made it come about. It's because of his intentions, and then of course other market participants, they can enter the market and can try to eradicate that the profit component that this guy earns. We understand that there's entrepreneurial profit which may be diluted through competition. Okay, so he may lose some of that, and maybe if they're really fierce, then he may go out of business. And then we could say, okay, now interest has disappeared. But has it really disappeared? No, because the guy who made it disappear, he acts under original interest himself, and he will have secured a margin. While driving the other guy out of business, he is making another interest margin. And that means that interest cannot vanish, it's just moving around. Yeah? But economically speaking, it's always there. It cannot be competed away. And that's what we define as interest. Okay, so this is the theory that Hülsmann proposed for interest, for the phenomenon of interest, and in my opinion, it's the best praxeological, or at least the most praxeological theory of interest that we possess. There's, however, one problem, and that's that Hülsmann does not address the question about the size of the rate of interest. He's just explaining the phenomenon of interest. He says, okay, there is interest, and yes, it cannot vanish, but he doesn't say anything about the magnitude of interest. And that's something that I would try to complement him with, yeah? And say, okay, listen, if we apply your theory to capital theory, then we even may say something about the magnitude of the rate of interest. And how can we apply it to capital theory? Well, of course, we also do that with the praxeological method, because praxeology, as we know, is very powerful. Why? Not only because its implications are true by necessity, but also because we can apply it in order to develop capital theory. Yeah? Capital only becomes capital through the evaluation of an entrepreneur. It's only in action that goods become capital goods, or objects become capital goods. Yeah? And this subjectivist theory of capital is the one that Lachmann and Kirchner have proposed in the 50s and 60s. And they are looking at capital as a very complex structure of complementary entrepreneurial plans, and Kirchner introduces this, what he calls forward-looking measurement of capital. So that means capital can only be measured in action, in entrepreneurial plans, and so on. And they come up with some interesting implications regarding capital theory. But again, that's not where we're going to go today, because I would like to keep it within the realm of interest rate theory. So the question is, what can such an approach do for us in the present setting? And yes, well, let's adopt the method of Lachmann, and he says, well, theory of capital must concern itself with entrepreneurs who form combinations of capital resources in their plans, and the way in which they regroup them when they revise their plans. So it's also under constant change that entrepreneurs make their plans and so on. So how do these plans look like? We can imagine the following. We can imagine that there's an entrepreneur, and he is in a position to produce the good C using some labor, which I call L1, and some other factor combination A. Okay, so what he's doing, he's taking the input A, he works on it, he uses some of his own labor or some other labor, and then he produces the good C. Okay, so that could be an entrepreneurial plan. Alternatively, however, and that's, mind you, the key task of the entrepreneur, to find out how should I produce, not only what should I produce, but also how should I produce a certain good. And yes, of course, this man has several alternatives of how he could produce good C. He could as well substitute labor by some capital good, actually by some fixed capital goods. Yeah? Fixed capital goods like machines are those who are designed to replace a certain amount of labor. Yeah? So if I build a wall, I can do this with 10 men working, for 10 days, or I can hire one man with one big machine. He can also do it in 10 days. Yeah? So the fixed capital good K, as we see it here, is designed to replace a certain amount of labor, and it will get us the same, or let's say a similar result, equivalent result in that case. Okay? So the good K, the fixed capital good, replaces some labor. Keep that in mind. But note that K is also produced with some labor. K doesn't fall from heaven. K is just the result of another production process where somebody used some labor and so on, and somebody produced it. Okay? But what do we know about K? Well, we know that the amount of labor, L2, that went into the production of K must have been less than the amount of L1 that goes into production of good C. Because if the amounts were greater, if I say, instead of having these 10 men building that wall, I could as well hire 13 men who build a machine and then build the wall, then of course this is not a viable entrepreneurial plan. Rather, capital are actually labor-saving inventions. People, it only becomes capital once it lowers the labor input in certain entrepreneurial plans. Okay, so we have L2 smaller L1. Okay, now of course, so far I have not spoken about prices, but that's only a small thing to add. We can add, or we can multiply these magnitudes with their respective prices, yeah? And then we have actually that in expectation, expenditures must be smaller than revenues, where again this inequality sign is a manifestation of originary interest. Okay, and the rest, bear with me, is just mathematics. Okay, so, or let's say that's one thing. Let me define the marginal product of capital. What is the marginal product? Yeah? Well, essentially, productivity is defined as output over input. Yeah? So if I don't know, when I say 10 workers can produce this wall in one day, then their productivity is 1 over 10 each. Okay, so output over input, that's our measure of productivity. Okay, and what does this mean in the present context? Well, look, let me define the marginal physical productivity of capital as L1 over K. And what do I mean? I mean, if an entrepreneur switches from the upper plan to the lower plan, then he takes in the capital unit and he sets free the amount of labor that he's no longer using. Yeah? So you can see from a systemic perspective, you can say his input is K, he's using the K now, and he's setting free all the laborers that he's no longer using. So that's his output, basically. Yeah? And, okay, I know this definition deviates from that of Rothbard and Mises, but I think I have good reasons to do it this way and not the other way. Yeah? We can discuss this later if you want. However, if you accept this definition of marginal physical product and accordingly marginal value product where we just add prices, then what follows is this. We have two production plans and we have something like a reservation expenditure on the part of the entrepreneur. He can say, okay, how much are you willing to pay for that capital unit? Well, he will say, okay, if it saves me money, then I will do it. Yeah? So that means his reservation expenditure is the amount that he presently spends on labor, which is W, the wage, times L1. So that's what he's currently spending. And under what circumstances is he willing to buy the capital good? Well, if it's cheaper, well, then it's going to do it. Yeah? So we have this, that his reservation expenditure must be, or is greater or equal than the amount of money that he spends on capital plus interest, of course. Yeah? And can interest be positive? Yes, it can. Why? Because L1 greater than L2. Yeah? We know that there was less labor has gone into the capital production than what he's using to build the wall. Yeah? So hence, there's less labor costs involved in the capital production than in the final good production. And Böhm-Bawerk would have called that roundabout modes of production as a different metaphor for the same thing. It's just that capital is a labor-saving institution. And hence, there is also scope for interest to be paid. And then we take this equation where now I have replaced interest by delta M. Interest is a monetary amount between or it's a difference between two monetary amounts. Yeah? It's M2 minus M1, okay? And I take this equation, divide by M1, and then what we have on the right-hand side is already the definition of the rate of interest, because that's M2 minus M1 over M1 is the rate of return. That's the rate of interest. And then if we say M1 is also the amount invested, then this must also be equal to PK times K, and then plugging this in gives us that the marginal value product of capital is 1 plus R. And that's quite interesting, to me. But anyway, it says that marginal productivity has a bearing on the size of the rate of interest, and that stands in complete opposition to what Murray Rothbard claims and others. And in fact, we can even say, remember this quote that I gave in the beginning, that they all have conflicting views of what the marginal productivity of capital does to the rate of interest. And I think we can answer this question now. We can say, oh, well, it's positively correlated. Okay, so then let me sum up. To the extent that fixed capital goods and the factor combinations that they replace require the same non-specific input, namely labor, their cost of production are equal. Okay. Yeah. Since fixed goods require less of that non-specific input, there exists an excess of the willingness to pay for these goods over their cost of production. This excess will always find a manifestation in the cost structure of an economy, and it cannot be competitive away. It is thus interest. In other words, the non-specificity of labor guarantees that marginal physical productivity always translates into a marginal value productivity. And that means that Böhm-Bawerk, he got it right. Yeah? I mean, of course, he used another method. Yeah? But I think, in terms of results, he's spot on. And we are now in a position to reformulate his theory in praxeological terms. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hendrik, for this very interesting and thought-provoking talk. I think, essentially, to sum it up, it's sound and safe, I think, but there are some questions as to details. But the overall picture is interesting. I think it contradicts a lot of what Austin said about the natural rate of interest. I'm not so sure whether Böhm-Bawerk got it right completely, but that turns on other issues. But I have to make some critical remarks which hopefully do not go to the heart of the matter from a praxeological perspective. So let me just put this on. I have this here so that you can read it as well. Okay, Hagedorn presents a praxeological model of interest, despite the fact that he is very critical with regard to the model dominating in Austrian economics. This model, he is critical with regards to, is the pure time preference theory of interest. At first blush, there seems to be a contradiction in Hagedorn's approach, but on closer inspection, I believe there is none at all. Because there is a problem with the idea of time preference indeed. The concept seems to dissolve into thin air when looked at more closely. Where time preference is taken to be a matter of degree, the notion appears to be psychological rather than praxeological. And where the notion is truly praxeological, the only timely aspect is the actuality of wanting, but that will not give you degrees. So there's something rotten in the state of Denmark. There's something really wrong with the pure time theory of interest. That's why I would agree with you that a different approach is called for, and I think your approach is different. But let's turn a bit more on the praxeological side, so to speak, the foundation underlying it. What is your understanding of praxeology? I'd say actually it is quite advanced and refined. You rightly contend that praxeology is the study of the formal implications of the concept of action, thus being a form of conceptual analysis. However, I think you err when concluding from this that arguments resulting from such an analysis are nothing but linguistic stipulations. To be sure, you didn't say that, you wrote it in the paper, but I think that it's somehow a tension underlying your thought. A more Straussian approach of descriptive metaphysics might have helped to see the nature and function of concepts in a more favorable light. I think you may appreciate too little that conceptual analysis is a method, and perhaps the only method, to uncover the necessary traits and features of the world around us, at least as it presents itself to us. For instance, understanding the concept of a natural number helps you to understand that there cannot be a greatest number, and it does so without stipulating that there is none. There is nothing about stipulation here, rightly so. Now, that was only one hint at the matter. I should continue with the, I think, with the two praxeological observations, which are very much at the upside of your approach. You introduced two very important observations, which I would say are really truly praxeological observations. The first is the non-specificity of labor. Although framed in an economic wording, this is essentially the idea that there is not saying ex ante what would count as a doing deemed necessary and sufficient by an agent to bring about what he wants, right? So there is no, if you remember my formula, the phi-ing, there is no specific phi. You cannot determine ex ante what phi-ing would be in the next explanation, right? This is completely dependent on the agent's subjective perspective, what he wants and what he believes, thus clearly introducing intentionality and thus intentional inexistence, the most important concept in this area. The agent's subjective, because of this intentional inexistence, the agent's subjective perspective may be or may appear erroneous, yet it, and it alone, makes what he deems necessary a doing, or in your words, labor. So to put it with Shakespeare, so long as man can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives, well, a demand for labor. This follows simply from the anthropological, not epistemological fact, may I stress this repeatedly, anthropological, not epistemological fact, that men will never cease to want. So that was the one praxeological observation, namely the non-specificity of labor. And if you mean by that what I meant with the non-specificity of the doing, I'm very much on your side, and I can prove you're right, and it's completely analytic. The other observation to be mentioned is the assumption of a value difference between means and ends. I could not agree more, and that for truly praxeological reasons. However, I am certain that Hülsmann derives this true conclusion incorrectly and from flawed premises. And it certainly does not help that he names this value difference original interest. This is unfortunately something which encounters us very often. We arrive at true conclusions with Austrian economics, but they really very often do not bother about how deriving them. So, and this in a way, does not add to the scientific reputation of Austrian economics, because it's not enough to have a true conclusion. It is imperative to derive it in a sound and solid way. So I agree with you, there is a necessary and essential value difference between means and ends, but it is to be shown and derived in the following way. What is the praxeological reason for the value difference? Recall the right-hand side of the analytic criterion for action I presented this morning. X phies because X wants that P and believes that if he phies, then P. By now you know that you may insert for phi any predicate in the appropriate tense and mode, right? For instance, Harry spills his drink because he wants to signal to his confederates that they begin a robbery and believes if he spills his drink, and so on. Okay, so you know that you have to insert the doing, the description of the doing at the place where the phi is. So that's where you put the labor in. Okay. Okay. What is the praxeological reason for the value difference? Recalling the right-hand side, X phies because X wants that P and believes that if he phies, then P. We would, in an informed manner of speaking, say that the end is what the agent aims at bringing about. P. That the confederates begin the robbery. So the end is what the agent wants. This is not a redescription merely, but that's the foundation of an economic talk about ends. It's founded in the praxeological notion of wanting. Right? So, but again, I'm very much on your side, and this will give you a strong argument for your conclusion. However, I'm not really sure whether you're really willing to accept it. Again, let me proceed. So the end is what the agent wants. In contrast, the means is what the agent deems necessary and sufficient in order to achieve the end. The phying, or what you say, the labor. Okay? Phying, or more precisely, his phying or that he phies. Choose whatever you like. So when Harry spills his drink because he wants that his confederates begin a robbery and believes if he spills his drink, his confederates begin a robbery, the means is the spilling, or that he spills, or his spilling, whatever you want, and the end is that his confederates begin a robbery. Now, this was for preparation purposes only. Now let's turn to the essential question. What now is valued and what is not? Clearly, we can answer this only relative to a given agent and a given action at a certain instant. It may change over agents, actions, and time. But if we hold this fixed, we see that value is attached only to the end, not to the means. And that's a difference, right? Value is attached only to the end, not to the means. The end is pursued for its own sake. The means is employed because of the recalcitrancy of the world only. Just because the world will not give us what we want right on the spot and without further ado is that we employ the means. So labor is toilsome in a way, right? Or so we think. I'm not talking about how things are, but how we perceive things to be. Hopefully this coincides with how things are, but there is no necessity in that. That's the point about descriptive metaphysics. We have to talk about that a bit more. So there is a value difference indeed, and it can be expressed less colorful, yet purely praxeological. Only what is wanted, and what is done is not. Again, I have to say, very much stressing, this is against Kant. Kant got it wrong. So does that mean that Böhm-Bawerk got it right? I don't know. Will this give us interest? Well, it's an important point to see that both notions, the pillars of your approach are sound and solid, rock bottom. But will this give us this theory of interest? I confess I have to think a bit more about it, and in the interest of time, I must leave it at that. Thank you. The floor is now open for discussion. We have about 6 minutes for discussion and then the opportunity for coffee. Stefan.
Well, Hendrik, we're not talking about time in your whole talk, and this is interesting to see an exposition of interest without mentioning time. My observation is what you're explaining is the productivity
Shall I answer this?
Your floor.
First of all, it's not completely right that there's no time in the talk. Remember that interest is the amount delta M, which is M2 minus M1. So M1 is the amount of money I spend at some point in time, and M2 is the amount that I receive at a later point in time.
Right, either on labor or on the capital.
I know. I'm just saying that the time dimension here is in the entrepreneurial plan. And that is, I think, very much in line with Mises, who says the time period of production is a praxeological category. It is rather something that happens in the entrepreneurial plan only, and has nothing to do with, say, objective time spans that go through the production structure. And why is that? That's also because we have the division of labor. Look, there's in the chain of production, as we see it in the economy, there's hundreds and thousands of entrepreneurs working, and they're all somehow interested in making profit, but they don't care about the time that passes while the materials are working their way through the production chain. The time dimension is only in the entrepreneurial plans, and that's where I have it. And the production structure itself is, for me, not the time dimension there for me is there. Not the right place to have the time concept.
We have 2 more questions and 3 minutes left, so be as brief as you can.
Okay, one remark and one short question. One remark is, no, 2 questions. Do you relate this in your paper, your approach to what Keynes has done?
No. That's a good point, no. That's a good question.
This was a large discussion in the 70s, and the paradox of capital was termed this that you cannot measure K without interest rates. So you are assuming when one.
Yeah, I know that argument, but to be honest, I think that if we take it from the entrepreneurial perspective, then we are so to say bypassing that problem, because he measures K only by his personal evaluation, and he does not need the rate of interest in order to determine the value of K. He is just saying, look, this is the amount that I'm paying for that capital good. That's all. And I think that this paper is, so to say, it has already solved that problem, has so to say, find a way around that problem. Even I know that it was a problem in the 70s.
If you found a way around it based on Austrian theory, this is a topic for a separate paper in mind.
Okay. Thanks. Yeah.
Ja.
Kurze Frage. In welchem Verhältnis steht die Ungleichung für das Kapital, in der die Arbeit auftaucht, zur Notion Arbeitsbefehle?
It is a brilliant question. Darf ich das sagen? It's a brilliant question. I think that yes, in some sense, you could accuse me of having made use of the labor theory of value. But I accept it. I'll take it. Yeah.
Okay, no further embarrassments, because now it's coffee time. Thank you, very, very inspiring talk.
Okay, thank you.
Help yourself to coffee.